Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce today my lovely colleagues, and it is Bernadette, Nadya Jaworsky, or also Nadya Jaworsky, right? And Ivana, Rapoš, Božič, and we are one research team together, and they're going to present to you findings of our research project about attitudes towards migration and about media and meaning making. And another colleague of our team is Radka Kovanova, who is sitting here, and I'm the last one. So now I give the floor to Nadya and to Ivana.
Thank you very much, Alica, for the introduction. Okay, it's all going to hell. How lay people make sense of migration-related news. So we have a quote to start this presentation off from Lenka. I remember before COVID, when on TV, there was a wave migration on the TV. There was always like migration, the dark crowds, someone interjects. The dark crowds are coming here. And I said, it's all going to hell. I was already waiting to see them walking here like this, and it didn't happen, right? Lenka's observation on the portrayal of migration in Czech television encapsulates the kind of doubts about media prevalent in many contemporary societies. Concerns over media manipulation and sensationalism abound, and portrayals of migration in the news are full of negative reportage, especially puzzling in the case of Central Europe, a region that doesn't receive many newcomers. Czechia in particular has few migrants and even fewer refugees, although that is slowly changing with recent events. Yet migration issues figure prominently in the media and on political and public agendas. Warnings like the one Lenka highlights, dark crowds are coming here, are common, even if unwarranted. Such an onslaught of dark-skinned people has prompted her to think it's all going to hell, only to be dispelled by the reality in a country that has, as Jelinkova puts it, a refugee crisis without refugees. So first, a little bit about the project. So our project is called The 13th Immigrant, an in-depth exploration of the public perception of migration in the Czech Republic. As I've already presented, there's this puzzle in Czechia that there's a low level of immigration, just under 6%, yet migration is a highly debated issue on the political agenda and among the public. By May 2018, Czechia had accepted just 12 of the 2,691 refugees mandated by the EU quota mechanism. Most studies on public attitudes are quantitative and fall short to explain what lies exactly behind the fears about the potential 13th immigrant. So a little bit about our research questions. Our overall research question is how do Czech residents make sense of the phenomenon of migration by drawing symbolic boundaries between themselves and migrants. More specifically, in the paper I'm going to talk to you about today, the question is, how do lay people make sense of media portrayals of migration? So I'm going to offer you a little bit about the theoretical frame, which is multifaceted. Mediatization has been seen as one of the four fundamental processes shaping modernity, alongside globalization, individualization, and commercialization. Media have supplanted institutions like family, school, and church in providing information and moral orientation, becoming society's most important storyteller about society itself. Deep mediatization is the newer, advanced stage of the process in which all elements of our social world are intricately related to digital media and their underlying infrastructures. And while all these debates are important, we follow Lunt and Livingstone and conceive of deep or mediaization in general as a sensitizing concept. It is in the context of deep mediatization that audiences create meanings about what they hear, see, witness, and read in migration-related news.
One technical thing, the slides are not moving on YouTube, so let me try just
Okay.
once again. I don't know if I will solve it, but I will just try it once. Turning on and off.
Okay, then we need to talk about audiences. The need to more closely examine the role of audiences in mediatization research, or what Schroeder is called audienceization. We join this audience turn and stress the lived experiences and media practices of lay people in relation to migration-related news. Following Schroeder, we see audiences as the people who in their capacity as social actors are attending to, negotiating the meaning of, and sometimes participating in the multimodal processes initiated or carried out by institutional media. And Broersma says, he refers to audience engagement, or the cognitive, emotional, or affective experiences that users have with media content or brands. It's a precondition for processes of meaning making, value creation, and connecting to public discourses. So we have mediatization and audiences. Now we have media effects. Existing literature has abundantly shown that media affect public attitudes toward migration, and results across Western countries are quite similar. Exposure to negatively tinted or stereotypical news about migration can increase so-called anti-migrant, stereotypical, or racist attitudes. But general news about migration doesn't always have a negative correlation. When it comes to the effects of positive coverage, or including the views of migrants themselves, the association with more positive attitudes seems more robust. And importantly, emotions, especially those triggered by visuals, affect attitudes. And finally, we have qualitative approaches. There are methodological and theoretical challenges that call for qualitative studies of media effects on attitudes toward migration. First, as Boda and Szabo explain in their study on media and crime, there's difficulty in ascertaining causality. How do we know that the media aren't affected by what people think? Second, as much as big data or computational approaches can help elucidate public attitudes, qualitative studies drill down beyond the how to the why of how lay people engage with media in the ways that they do. Third, Lechler et al. Call for increased attention to visuals, not least because they're crucial to understanding emotional responses to migration, which are key determinants of attitudes and behavior. I think it's another technical difficulty.
Yeah, it is, and I don't know how to solve it right now, so just go on and I will try to do something here.
Okay, and finally, we have the theoretical frame of cultural repertoires. From the perspective of cultural sociology, meanings never exist in a vacuum. They're intersubjectively shared and stored in the symbolic system of culture. In this respect, meaning making is never an individual task. When individuals make sense of the world around them, they draw on available cultural repertoires, defined as available schemas, frames, narratives, scripts, and boundaries that actors draw on in social situations. Such cultural repertoires represent important resources that aid the capacity of individuals to make evaluative judgments and to draw symbolic and social boundaries. Media are important intermediaries of cultural repertoires because they have the capacity to make specific narratives and meaning structures more prominent than others. I'm going to turn it over to Ivana for the research map.
I'm very sorry, but we are not live streaming right now, so I will try to fix it. I'm sorry for that. Give me like a minute.
It was too heavy of a topic to be live streamed, I'm afraid. Is there a way how to, for instance, record it on this Zoom and we will just put it on the YouTube after maybe?
Yeah, we are still recording.
Okay.
I'm not sure about live streaming, but it says live. So I will hope that we are live streaming. Apologize once again.
So from this slide, if you can. Okay, so thank you very much, Nadya, for the word. And what I'm going to do right now is that I'm going to walk you through the research methods and even most importantly, through our research findings. So as a part of the wider project, we have conducted altogether 80 qualitative semi-structured interviews in 5 localities. Brno, Kuřim, Teplice, Vyšší Brod, and the village, whose name we keep secret because it was so small that we could not guarantee the privacy to the research participants if we disclose the name. And you can see the marcation of the localities here on this map. So we try to somehow cover different parts of the Czech Republic. When choosing the 5 localities, we aimed for the diversity in terms of the economic and the political power of the 5 localities, the size of their population with a migratory background, their history of the cross-border movement, and you see that 2 localities are located almost directly at the borders, and the overall cultural armature of these cities. Now, one of the important findings which we gained through these semi-structured interviews, which represented the first part of our research, was the surprising finding how often the media came into discussion in response to the very first question we asked, like, what do you imagine when we mention migration? And a lot of the people immediately linked their imagination of the migration to the media, which really made us alerted to the fact how important is it for their understanding of the entire phenomena of migration. And we decided to follow up on this topic because it seemed interesting to us. So additionally, we conducted 4 focus groups in 4 localities, skipping on the village and the 4 of them. And we devoted these 4 focus groups specifically to trying to find out how the lay people in Czechia make sense of the migration news. Some of the topics we covered with them, and these are like 4 research or 4 focus group questions which we included. We were curious, how often do they come across migration related news in the Czech media in the first place? What do they usually hear or read about migration? Based on what criteria do they decide whether migration related news should be trusted or not? What kind of migration related news they miss in the media? I would also like to show you how the structure of our sample for the focus group looked like. So we aimed for the diversity in different categories, and prior to inviting the lay people to be part of our focus groups, we asked them to fill in a short online questionnaire when we ask about their basic socio-demographic characteristics, but also about their migration attitudes and the type of the media they follow. And what I would like here to point your attention to, and I hope I click on a good pointer, yes. So these last 2 columns refer to the migration attitudes. And what I would like to point out that the focus groups were quite diverse in terms of the migration attitudes. So for instance, in Kuřim, there was at least 1 participant who said that the migration is really very much worsening the life in Czechia, as well as really improving the life in the Czechia. So you see the range, that's the first 2 numbers, and then the mean, which is in the brackets. In terms of the media preferences, which was also part of this short questionnaire, it turned out that most of the focus group participants follow the public service broadcasters, such as Czech television and Czech radio. Almost none of them mentioned the private TV televisions. They also follow major online news portals such as Seznam Správy, iDnes.cz, Novinky.cz, and from social media they follow Facebook. And to give you a little bit of a context how this maybe illustrates the general preferences of the lay people in Czechia. So according to the Reuters Institute, and this was a recent study from 2021, the Czech television is watched at least weekly by almost 60% of the population, and also 60% of this population trust this source. 14% listen to Czech radio at least weekly, and the online news from Seznam Správy, iDnes, and Novinky.cz are also consulted weekly or more frequently by 50%, 39%, 34% of the population respectively, and of all the social media, 42% of the lay people or the participants of that specific survey follow those news at least once per week. So what I want to say by this is that this structure of our focus group kind of mimics the general preferences for media in Czechia. So what we did with the data after we collected them, so of course we let them transcribe, and we work with the verbatim transcripts. And when analyzing them, we utilized the meaning-centered approach of the strong program in cultural sociology that works with the three premises. And I think most of the people sitting in the audience know that this program recognizes the relative autonomy of the culture. So the culture as an independent variable, focuses on the in-depth reconstruction of the meanings through the fixed description, and is dedicated to the causal specificity, so anchoring the causality in proximate actors and agencies. In other words, we were trying to focus on the meaning making and how the meaning making is collectively shared in the society and what the role of media is in this meaning making. We conducted several rounds of open focus and the theoretical coding. And the surprising finding from the focus groups is that the extent of the criticism directed at the portrayal of migration by Czech media is shared by research participants across not only all focus groups, but also across differences in their demographic characteristics, migration views, and media preferences. And now I'm already moving to the presentation of the findings, which I will do in 2 steps. So first of all, I'll illustrate the dominant cultural repertoire, which we identify both in the AT interviews and also in the focus groups, and which is related to the media. This is important to say because there are also other cultural repertoires that inform the migration attitudes in Czechia, but this one is specifically linked to the media. And so when we ask the research participants, what is their first association with the term migration? The idea of migration as an invasion often came up, regardless of the types of the attitudes the individual participants held towards the migrants, and also regardless, and this is also important, to the extent they believe that migration really is an invasion, but this was just something spontaneous that was provoked in their mind, in their head, when we mentioned the word migration. And what is interesting that even though they immediately thought of this invasion, their emotional responses to this cultural repertoire were quite different. Some of them were genuinely scared, whereas others were more like sarcastic, and they were critically doubting that imagination. And I would like to show you 2 more quotations that I think illustrate this well. So the first quotation to my question, what does come to your mind when I say migration? Astrid, over 30 years old, from Teplice, replied, well, I'll be honest. It is those catastrophic scenarios, like from some tabloids. It is those like fake photos of those crowded boats and trains and everything. But I know it's nonsense. But when I hear migration, this is my first association. And then the second quotation, to more or less the same question, from Kristina, over 70 years old, from Teplice as well. Well, unfortunately, I immediately imagine those pictures they've been running on TV about how migrants come to us on boats and in various ways, in trucks, and these mostly, yeah, they are black. They're Africans or from Afghanistan. So this is what comes to my mind first. And to tell you the truth, I'm scared of it. So in the first quote, as you can see, Astrid really laughs as she describes the ways in which Czech media portray migration. Even though she imagines the catastrophic scenarios with the crowded boats, hardly an amusing topic, it is at the same time she considers it fake and nonsense. This quote reveals the sense of irony evident in many of our research participants who, even though they imagine this Imagine cultural repertoire, they were also not finding it genuine enough, and they were very reflexive about it. On the other hand, Christina describes a very similar portrayal with people in boats and possibly trucks. She also sees a reason for fear. She comments that they are Black, they are Africans, or from Afghanistan, highlighting the otherness of the people on the move. By the way, in one of our other research papers, we also discuss how the term, the label immigrant got very much associated with these Black people coming on the boats from specific parts, and it does not no longer represent this all-encompassing category of the newcomers, but a very specific type of immigrants. So this now illustrates what we see as a dominant cultural repertoire of migration, which is spread by the media in the Czech Republic. What I'm going to do now in the second step is to walk you through like 3 critical remarks, which we managed to get from our research participants in the setting of the focus group. And which shows that even though all of them engage with this critical repertoire, no, not all of them engage with it in the same manner, and some of them are quite critical about it. So, the first set of the characteristics that the research participants find very typical for the media portrayal of migration is the periodicity and the sensationalism. So they believe that migration is only an episodic topic, which is always presented in a sensational issue, and which they can't follow in the media continuously, but it's always connected to some specific events. And I think one of the short quotation illustrates this really well. It's like COVID, 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 Afghanistan, because at the time we were conducting the focus groups, there was the withdrawal of the American forces. So there were some Afghans coming to the Europe, COVID, 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 Afghanistan. And in the understanding of the research participants, this is problematic because then every time they read about the migration, they get to read about it in some sensational manner when something's going on. The second set of the features that the research participants actually criticize about the media portrayal of the migration is the tendencies and the misrepresentation. And this is actually a very robust finding because regardless of the media attitudes, the research participants, they found an agreement that the migration news are hardly to be trusted because they always are powered by specific hidden interests. It's only that they could not agree whether those interests are the NGOs in the background who are trying to pursue some liberal agendas and presenting the migration as something which is unproblematic, even though they suspected it's much more problematic, or whether it's the politicians in Czech Republic who are trying to score the political points on making this topic sensational, but it does not represent such a sensation at all. So there was a overall skepticism about to what extent what they can read in the Czech media represents the what is going on at the borders of different countries adequately, and to what extent it's just really very tendentious representation of the reality. And the final set of the critical reflections concerns the negativity and the selectivity of the media. And again, regardless of the migration attitudes of our focus group participants, they all agreed that The only thing they can read about the migration in media is highly selective and always focus on the representation of the negative news. The people who have died, the people who have been smuggled across the borders, that there is no continuation about what some of the research participants called the positive stories, how people are being integrated, what they do 2, 3, 4, 5 years after they cross the borders, what happened with their lifestyles. And the interesting finding of our research was actually that they were hungry for them, regardless whether they were more skeptic or more open towards the migrants. They were really genuinely interested, and they could see through this media representation of the migration, asking what's happening with those people. So the research participants, and we presented these critical remarks mostly because we want to illustrate that the research participants in our focus groups represent a media audience that is reflexive and it knows what it wants to learn about the migrants. They realize that the dominant cultural repertoire is simplistic and narrow, so it does not account for the diversity of lifestyles or worldviews among the immigrants. And even though some of them might feel skeptical about the migration as a specific phenomena, they also express this willingness to learn more, which might eventually also have some impact on the shifting attitudes. But this we can't say openly, but in any case, this is already an interesting finding as such. So moving towards the conclusions. So first of all, we show that the image of migration as an invasion of crowds, mostly of dark-skinned men coming on boats or in vans, is a shared cultural repertoire which is periodically reproduced by media audiences. The national media or news in the Czech language work as a general frame for formation of this dominant cultural repertoire. They create a national community that shares a collective representation not only of themselves, but also of the others. In other words, it's a cultural shared imagination that sediments in the form of a common sense. The second point is that we argue that not only institutionalized media are responsible for the creation of this shared understanding, but also audiences act as active producers of meaning. And this is important in relation to the current debates about the authenticization and the mediatization. So as Hermes puts it, wittingly or unwittingly, we are not just chroniclers, we are coaches in media literacy. So lay people actively produce additional layers of meaning to the circulating repertoire. Therefore, it is not only the media, but also active engagement by audiences with media messages that creates a meaningful context of culturally shared understanding. So not only the media, but also the audiences, they are all engaging in the production of cultural repertoires. So nevertheless, the fact that the focus group participants are able to laugh with shared irony, and I think it was quite visible in the two quotations, about the sensationalism of migration-related news indicates that a certain level of skepticism towards the dominant portrayal of migration has been internalized also in the form of common sense. The capacity to stimulate shared humor makes this cultural repertoire resonate even further. Peculiarly, since the 2015 migration crisis, images of migration as invasion have become a prevalent shared representation of migration also in Czechia. As we all know, a country with very few immigrants and even fewer refugees. So as highlighted earlier, the lived reality is that most newcomers are labor migrants. They come from the Slavic countries or from Vietnam and not from the Middle East or from the North Africa. These really represent a very tiny percentage of the population of migrants living here. So finally, to conclude, the simplified and the narrow image of migration as invasion does not seem to leave much room for the development of positive attitudes towards migration. However, the monothematic cultural repertoire also fosters the curiosity of lay people who, as actively engaged audiences, effortlessly identify the missing pieces of information about migration in Czechia. And this is also basically one practical finding related to our research, which we are interested in communicating to the media, like how important is to also report on this follow-up events connected to the migration, not only focusing on the instance of the border crossing, but also on the wider processes of migration that follows once people settle down and eventually integrate. So thank you very much. That's all from our part, and we are looking forward to the questions.